let me invite them up just now. Please come up, sit. And I want to do a really terrible job of introducing them. And here's the order. I'm going to ask them to speak in for just 5 minutes. And, I know, we're going to move the podium. So first, I'm going to ask David. David Lapin is the Executive Director of Community Music Center of Boston, has been for 27 or 28 years, and is really sort of this, mensch of the arts in Boston. I mean, it's just kind of all the meetings, all the convenings, he's got to be, it's kind of built around him, or he's in the middle of every serious conversation. And we have Jason Yoon, who has been the Executive Director of New Urban Arts in Providence, Rhode Island for just 3 years. But not only young, he has already led several arts organizations. He has founded and directed 7 Arts in the Queens Museum, has worked with DreamYard in New York, has really got a preposterous amount of experience for his years, and is a part of a really rich conversation that is happening in Providence, Rhode Island. And then Andrea Temkin, who has the title that you want, which is Resources and Resilience Coordinator for the Alliance for Arts Learning in Alameda County in Northern California. And her background is, sorry to say it, as promiscuous as mine. She has worked in every art form, really in every kind of role within arts learning, both from working with muralists in the public schools project and major symphonies, and she's also been the executive director of a community music school of art and music. So I'm going to invite each of our colleagues to speak in response for just 5 minutes. We'll see if we can get a little heat going up here. And this may be the time when you want to start jotting questions in response to their thoughts or my own thoughts. But let me invite David to kick it off. And I'll sort of do like a timekeeping thing, but probably won't have to.
Thanks, Eric. I am the Venerable David Lapin, the Venerable Community Music Center of Boston. And I suppose that's one reason why I'm the one up here that is wearing a suit. And Jason, to my right, is wearing jeans. I do remember my first Guild conference back in 1984. I was wearing a suit on that occasion also. The difference was that the pants had bell bottoms. But I would also draw your attention to the fact that since I am in the community arts movement, like Eric Booth, all right, I've got on Reeboks and Nike. So, and Jason's the one with leather shoes on. So what do we do? What have we done for 101, 102 years now? And I'm sure a lot of you can empathize with this. We teach music. It's a humble vocation. We, 101 years ago, taught immigrant kids Clementi sonatinas and those horrible Danklev concertos for violin, and we still do that today. And we're proud of that because I think there is an element of cultural transmission and absorption that occurs in that process that informs all the community values that Eric listed in his PowerPoint. But the truth of the matter is that Community Music Center of Boston, like Settlement Music School, Cleveland Music School Settlement, 3rd Street, all of the charter members of the Guild, also have been and remain extremely flexible institutions. They are used to challenges, they respond creatively to them, and just to give you a few touchstones along our history of some of those changes, which probably would not have occurred to our founders back in 1910. Around World War II, we started teaching adults for the first time. Now, I mean, that was an epiphany that you could teach adults music in a community school setting. I don't know why they didn't think about that in 1910, but for some reason, 3 decades later, a generation later, adults became part of our teaching orbit. In 1971, the Globe actually wrote an article about the fact that the Community Music Center was going to offer pop and rock instruction for the first time. And that too was a kind of epiphany, that you could open up the curriculum to a much wider set of possibilities in the traditional classical music tradition. In the 1970s, we offered music therapy for the first time as a departmental component of the Music Center. And the interesting thing about our work with special needs in 4 decades now is that the populations themselves have changed dramatically, depending on the circumstances that we confront each year. So, for example, in the 1980s, we began a program of music therapy for persons with HIV and AIDS. Most recently, we've been doing a lot of great work with persons with Alzheimer's and kids that have various autism spectrum disorders. So there is, even within the hidebound, silo-driven world of the most venerable community schools of the arts, capacity to get outside the silo and to begin to absorb all the important trends in music and society that we want to refine and give voice to. So what are the challenges and ways that can change our thinking today? The basic answer to that is I don't know. I never know until it happens. All of a sudden, you will be struck, and I say that to anyone that works in a community arts organization, with a new way of thinking, an epiphany that brings some change to the staid way of thinking that you have proceeded to operate in the past. And I'll give 2 examples of that from my own recent experience. One, as Eric mentioned, is LC Stemma. I went down a few years ago with a study group from Boston to Caracas to explore why LC Stemma was so successful. And it is. It's an amazing enterprise in a country that is so incredibly dysfunctional in all other respects. And the one thing that I took back from that changed my way of thinking about music education was mentorship. That a lot of the structure of LC Stemma's ensembles and orchestras allows more proficient musicians to work with younger, less proficient ones. And when you think about how we go about teaching music education, this is to some degree an exaggeration, but in large part, we teach according to level, and we don't allow for that kind of natural teaching that should occur between students, not just between students and teachers. You think about the way you learn tennis or any other sport, you would always benefit from playing with a better player, and that's what, it's not the only thing LC Stemma does, but it was the one difference that struck me so palpably, and which I then brought back to Boston and tried to introduce into the way we organize our ensembles and chamber orchestra at the Music Center. A second challenge to my way of thinking is a guy named Ko, who came to me with an idea called Beat Shop. And actually, Beat Shop is represented in one of the booths at this conference, and I commend your attention to it. It's a way of using computers to create music and compose music and give youngsters a voice. I was struck at Eric's PowerPoint when he talked about new art and listed the examples, that there was no new music listed. And isn't that typical of music schools? We are obsessed with teaching people how to recreate music, largely of dead composers. But we really aren't in the business of giving them an opportunity to find their own voice and to actually write music, produce music, create music, find a way of expressing themselves through music. And if there's any one change, any one way that I think all of us could benefit dramatically in music, is taking the example of our other disciplines, in visual arts and theater and dance particularly, and give our students the opportunity to find their own voice. In the 1970s, we ran an ad campaign called Make Your Own Kind of Music. And it was a great tagline, but I think what they meant was rock, pop, folk rock, they didn't mean find your own voice. And for me, as I entered the venerable twilight decade of my association with the Community Music Center of Boston and the Guild, what I would like to see more than anything else is an emphasis on composing and creating as distinct from recreating voices in music. And for me, that would be my principal message for everyone out here, is how to get out of our own silo, our way of thinking about what we do as arts enterprises. Do I have a couple more minutes, or am I done? Done.
Thank you. But we'll have response time. One quick comment before I give it to Jason. One thing I was struck with is David's comment that the change moment, he says, I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's this epiphany of encounter with something new that changes what you know. That goes right back to my comment about the artistic experience. When you actually change the sense of the way the world is or can be, that is the moment of consequence. So in fact, we are bringing our art selves to these other conversations, to these explorations out in the world as art entities discovering some truths and bringing them back home to our institutions. Jason.
Hi everyone, I am Jason Yoon. I'm the Executive Director of New Urban Arts. As Eric mentioned, we are a storefront community art studio and gallery in Providence, Rhode Island. We're entering our 15th year of programs. I'm in my 3rd year as the Executive Director. Our mission is to empower young people as artists and leaders to develop a creative practice that they can sustain throughout their lives. We have a pretty strong theory of change that creative and independent thinking is necessary for all young people, regardless of their background. So all of our programs are designed to do that. We recruit artists from the community. These are professional artists. These are amateur artists and local college students. These are youth alumni of our programs to mentor young people in collaborative, reciprocal, mutually respective, generative relationships in year-long free after-school and summer programs. We are new to the Guild, and we are new to this, I think, broader conversation around institutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our silos, and I think you've inspired me to be honest about them. We are a scrappy, small, nonprofit organization that's slowly growing into adolescence. And the history of New Urban Arts has been very much about fighting for a place at the table for the kind of generative, spontaneous, youth-directed, youth-centered work that we've been doing. And in the last few years, I think we've been able to kind of anchor the work we've been doing institutionally. But with that attitude of fighting for a place at the table and fighting for a new way of working, we have an organizational and institutional fear of larger institutions, of more historical and traditional organizations. We do sometimes struggle to work with museums, with larger cultural institutions, partially because we fought so hard to create a vital community for ourselves, and also partially because of a cultural mistrust of larger, more traditional institutions, and a fear that that agenda might distract from the kind of space that we're creating for young people. So we ourselves have some work to do to think about how we can step outside of that silo. I want to tell the story of how New Urban Arts was founded, which might, I think, offer a nice counterpoint to what David's been talking about. Tyler Denmead was the executive director that preceded me, and he had been a student at Brown University in Providence, and came into Brown as a pre-med student. Brilliant young guy, suburban upper middle class kid from Columbus, dead set on a science and medical career. Spends a summer in France apprenticing himself to a chef at a small restaurant, trying to learn French, doing language exchange in exchange for learning some cooking skills. This chef did something for Tyler that I think no one had ever done for him in his incredibly privileged education, and that was challenge him to make dinner for him. And, Tyler, for all his brilliance and I think for all the privilege and kind of resourced and advantages he'd had in life, had really never had anyone challenge him to try to experiment, to risk failure. And he talks really eloquently about fighting his way through this kitchen. They called him the stain, in French, because he was so bad at it. But he would cook a meal every day, and every day the chef would kind of eat it and unlock something in him. So Tyler comes back to Providence, completely transformed, and in his own words, drops the pre-med major, starts painting and drawing all the time, becomes an art history major, starts hanging out with all the hippie artists at Brown and at the Rhode Island School of Design, and wants to start a mentoring program that mimicked the kind of apprenticeship and the kind of challenge and provocation that this chef in France had proposed to him. And in 1997, this was a really radical way to think about after-school education. It was a really radical way to think about youth development. It was a really radical way to think about how artists and learners and young people could come together to make space for themselves. But he himself had been so shaken and disrupted by this chef that it was the kind of experience he really wanted to create for other young people. So he proceeds to get an Echoing Green Fellowship grant, a Swearer Center grant, which is the public service center at Brown, to rent a small attic space in a downtown church in Providence. And they recruit some kids from local high schools, they recruit some local artists from local colleges, and they build this thing together. They didn't have a name, they didn't know what they were doing. Tyler himself would be the first to admit that he was not a skilled artist, a master artist. He wasn't even he was an art history major. But these young people kept coming back. Because they would be challenged to think for themselves in ways that school wasn't, that even some fancier art programs that they were in and art-centered high schools weren't. But this idea to build something and to form these kind of deep relationships and to question together was really important. And so, it's kind of at the heart of what we do, and it's the heart of what we've been trying to do in the last 15 years. Now, that also doesn't mean we don't have things to learn from other institutions, but we have fought so hard for this kind of pedagogy. And now we're at this place where we're trying to step outside of that. And I want to address this, you asked us to talk about this idea of collective impact. The thing that's unique about Providence, and we'll be talking about this later today, is that New Urban Arts is a member of a collective of youth arts organizations in Providence called the Providence Youth Arts Collaborative. And one of the things that we're looking to do is try to make a stronger collective voice for youth arts learning in policy dialogues in the city. The 6 members of the Providence Youth Arts Collaborative are all fairly young. We're all within the 10, I think, to 25-year range. We're all fairly small and place-based. We have a common commitment to relationships between artists and young people and youth-directed and youth-empowered learning. That said, we're wildly different. We serve different age ranges. We serve different neighborhoods. We have very different instructional strategies and different values, even though we have this common commitment. And taken individually, each of the members of PIAC could easily be seen as a boutique anomaly. Oh, that's a really cute little program that you've started, and that's great for those kids. But you don't need a seat at this table, or this doesn't signify anything more important. But what we've been able to do, despite all of our differences, is to be able to come together and make a general case and a statement that, no, this is a thing. This is a thing. This is significant. The rise of all these kinds of programs and the rise of all these kinds of spaces and the rise of young people in the city thinking for themselves through art and through artists that care about them and want to get to know them is something that the city should be paying attention to, is something that's meaningful for shifts in education and how we can improve learning for young people. And it's really tough to have that kind of collective impact, but I think we can safely say that we've been involved in larger dialogues that we wouldn't have been involved with otherwise if we had stayed in our silos and said, you know what, that's great that you do that thing down the street and I do my thing at New Urban Arts. But because the city government and because people involved in cultural and educational policy know that it's not just a few isolated boutique programs, but actually a real force in this city. And not just a force, but also a nationally recognized force. A lot of programs that have gotten a lot of national recognition, that they want us at the table. So a lot of work that we've been doing with teaching artists and arts learning in community-based settings has been involved in how the city's talking about cultural policy and its cultural plan. And where that cultural plan goes is a lot more work for us to do, but I can pretty safely say that if there was no PIAC and if we weren't talking to each other and if we weren't putting aside our differences and, yes, the competition for limited resources and focusing on what that greater truth is that Eric is talking about, we wouldn't be able to influence the people that we need to influence. How am I doing on time? Okay.
Beautiful. Well done. One quick thing I want to point out. It's so interesting, these first 2 presentations, the venerable and the scrappy, both with good intentions toward the other, but the scrappy has been fighting for a place at the table. We, as educators, know what to do with the kid in the room who is fighting to be heard, who's fighting for a way to be included into the work. We're really good at that. How can we translate that kind of capacity, that knowledge, that amazing skill of inclusion for those who aren't fitting yet? How can we translate that into our ecosystem so we can play like an ensemble? And it certainly isn't because the venerable intentionally want to suppress and want to keep out. It's just we're opening this stuff up now. And whether we should have done it before or not, irrelevant. Now is our opportunity, and it's sitting right next to each other. Andrea.
Great, thank you. I'm Andrea Temkin, and I am both the Visual and Performing Arts Manager at the Alameda County Office of Education, which is in the East Bay of San Francisco, and the Resources and Resiliency Coordinator for the Alliance for Arts Learning Leadership, which I have to correct the way you said it. It's an alliance that was formed by the Alameda County Office of Education. We have 18 different school districts that we oversee. And in 1999, Sheila Jordan was our recently politically elected official, the superintendent of schools for the county. And part of her campaign pledges was to bring the arts back to those 18 districts. So she was able to carve out a half-time position. And Louise Music was hired in that position, and she quickly realized that as a half-time position overseeing 18 different school districts that included Oakland Unified and Mountain House, which is a two-room school district, one school district up in the foothills, that as a half-time position she wasn't really going to be able to have the impact that they wanted to have. So the Alliance for Arts Learning Leadership was formed, and it is not an alliance for arts education or for arts learning, but for arts learning leadership. And what that meant was that from the beginning, the concept was to build leadership at all levels, among parents, among teachers, among teaching artists, district superintendents, our elected officials, so that we were really looking at doing something in a long-term kind of way. I got involved as a consultant leading a strategic planning process for them in 2002. And what I wanted to say about the Alliance is that one of the reasons that as a consultant I was attracted to working with the Alliance, as Eric said, I've been around a couple blocks in the arts administration and arts education worlds over the last period of my life. And they were doing something that I'd never seen anyone do before. And that was they were getting out of the corner that we as arts educators, I think, have painted ourselves into over the years, which is we're special, we do all these things that no other discipline can do, we're going to save lives, and we need, so therefore, you need to give us more money, you need to give us a dance studio, you need to give us more facilities. And we really, I think, painted ourselves into a corner, and the Alliance was a coming together in the beginning of just a few volunteer groups that included community arts organizations, district level arts coordinators from a couple districts, a institution of higher education, a state department that program that was providing training to arts teachers across California. And kind of came together in a very ad hoc way and met on a regular basis, figured out one thing that they wanted to do in common, executed that, and from that, it has grown over the years. And the partners, right now we have a governance structure that we worked to build together with our partners, because you could only be ad hoc for so long, and then we got too big to be ad hoc. And people were starting to get burned out because everybody was being invited to every meeting. And so we worked with a consulting group, Wellspring Consulting out here in Connecticut and Boston, to develop a governance structure. And in our governance structure, last spring, we did a survey of everyone who was part of it. And we didn't realize until we did that there were more than 90 individuals in this governance structure representing over 50 different organizations. So kind of going from that little group that started out 10 years ago or so, we've really grown. And it's meant a lot of things. And as Jason was saying, there's a place where you have to give up some things in order to be part of a group. Doesn't mean that in your own organization, in your own work, that you're not continuing to do those things, but as a group, you have to sort of come together and figure out what is that common thing that we can all agree on and that we're going to aim for. We feel we started out as sort of, collaborators. Then we kind of moved into being more partners. Now we're a network that is county-wide and also a little region-wide. We have people from outside our county now in our network. And we feel that our next step is to move to a collective impact. And when we say collective impact, we're really talking about a specific structure that was, there's an article, it's called Collective Impact. It was in the Stanford Social Innovations Review.
We'll get it listed so people can access it. It's a really important article. We'll have it on the resources section.
Great. And John, I have to tell you, John Kania and Mark Kramer, who are from FSG Consultants, really wrote this article. And in it, what they are saying, and they're talking about change in education. But they have examples across other, the environmental movement and some other fields as well. And the idea is that we can't, if we all just keep, the analogy I heard someone else give was, we're trying to make change. There's an obstacle there. And, it could be one of the isms that willpower talked about our first day. But there's a brick wall in front of us, and we're trying to knock it down, basically. We're trying to get through it. And if each of our organizations is pushing on an individual different brick, the best we're going to do is get a wall with a few holes in it. But if we all come together and we figure out where the leverage point is on that wall, and then we all push on that leverage point, the wall's going to come down. And I think that, we're obviously living in a world in transition right now. We're looking at the end of the last standing economic system that was developed in response to the Industrial Revolution. Something new is going to come. We don't know what that is yet. We're a world in transition, and things like Occupy Wall Street are starting to do the same thing. It's starting to be people coming together and figuring out where the leverage points are and pushing on those leverage points. I can stop now.
Okay, let's stop there.
I can
Good.
stop now. I've
Thank
got
you.
more.
So I'm going to throw I'm going to make one comment. I'm going to throw one question to our panel, but this is the questions moment. We have typically left a grossly inadequate amount of time for conversation, but we'll have a little bit. So if you have questions, raise them. Two things I just want to point out that I heard from Andrea. First of all, notice she had a 10-year conversation that led to where they are now. Do not let this discourage you, but that's how long it takes. We're talking about serious change here in the status quo, something we haven't seen before. So don't underestimate the kind of just how long it takes to bring about that change. And then one other item that is a very important part of the collective impact work is they picked a goal and they succeeded at achieving it. So one of the early builders of potency is, even in the early stages, identify something that you think you can achieve together and go for it and make sure you succeed to build your sense of potency. So a question I want to ask the panel for very brief responses before we open it up is, okay, we heard three different perspectives to the kind of the big landscape view that I offered, and I'll vamp a little bit if nobody has an immediate answer. What is the greater truth that contains these three different perspectives we've heard? What is the greater truth that contains the necessity to go deeper but be flexible within a venerable silo, and to be an upstart, angry organization, and to be a network-building organization? If we're building for a better future that really is full of what it is we have to bring to it, what is the greater truth? You're nodding.
I'm nodding. Okay, I'm nodding.
Does that mean you have a thought?
It means I'm empathetic.
Oh, okay. Good. And you know what? If you were going like this, I know what that means too. Any thoughts up here?
I was thinking of what the guild, what can the guild, how does the guild respond to that question? And the thing that has struck me, it hit me from Curtis's earliest comments on amplifying voices and the danger of allowing that to lead to distortion. The Guild has done an amazing job over the past 10 years of growing its membership, as witnessed by the terrific turnout of delegates to this conference. Far more than in 2004, the last time you were in Boston, and infinitely more than in either 1990 or 1980. The difference is that in those conferences, we knew each other, and we formed bonds that lasted for decades. I think the challenge for the Guild now, that it's the Guild for Community Arts Education and not the National Guild for Community Schools of the Arts, is to reinvent ways of establishing that bond among a much larger constituency of arts educators. So I think it's great that this has happened. This is a wonderful tribute to the board and management of the Guild. But we have to find a way now of unifying the conversation across a much larger constituency and doing it in a way that doesn't lead to distortion.
Answers?
Well, what I'm going to say is I think the greater underlying truth is that not just us here on the panel, but everyone in this room, is that we have the answers. You know, we're trying to create solutions for the problems in the world that we all share, and I think that people in this room, almost more than anyone else, has the answers to this because we're so rooted in our communities. We're not afraid to risk. We're not afraid to change. We're in touch with both our elders and our youth. And we have a certain level of flexibility to experiment. And, you know, right now I'm working for an educational institution that's also a government institution. I mean, if you could think of two worse bureaucracies to bring together. And to make movement in there is very, very difficult. But in our field, we can make movement, and we have the creativity, we have the artists, we have the people who are thinking outside the box. So I think that's the greater truth that we have here. We have something here to offer the education system, the environmental system, people who are trying to make change. I think we have something to offer.
A quick answer, Jason?
I'll try to make it quick. Something I've been thinking about, you know, in the last few days. New Urban Arts was visited by a delegation from Singapore's Ministry of Youth, Sport, and Culture. And they were doing a 2-day learning trip to visit community arts spaces and apprenticeship training programs in New York, Providence, and I think maybe Boston. And I had a long conversation with them about why Singapore, this city-state that is outperforming the US, I guess, on international assessments, whose students seem to do really well on achievements, why they would be interested in my messy storefront art studio where kids and artists hang out and do crazy stuff. And what they said was, you know, we really have to have a paradigm shift for how we prepare our young people. We really need to think about creative spaces for learning, spaces to dabble, to experiment. And, you know, their itinerary included, I think, no schools, but all community arts and learning spaces. And I was grilling them because I was so fascinated by this, that this city-state that on so many indicators may, you know, social welfare indicators may be better than the US is interested in learning from our community art spaces, the work that we're all doing in this room. So the thing I've been thinking about since then is that where the instructional innovation in America is? You know, is it happening in our shops? And if we don't commonly recognize that and own that as an asset, it may be difficult to move the needle on anything.
Thank you. I'm going to ask for quick answers because we're way down to a few minutes, but want to get a few questions up here. Here's a really specific one. Within your community, who have been your greatest non-arts allies in moving our field's goals forward? Thoughts? Who have been your greatest non-arts allies in moving the goals of our field forward?
Well, more recently, we have been able to pull into our alliance the state PTA, for instance, which now has in California an entire section on their website about how to support the arts and how to make sure that the arts are in your schools, and who are doing a pilot right now in several school districts to look at how they can use the arts to engage parents who are not engaged, particularly across multicultural communities in our state. We've worked with institutions of higher education that are not arts related, but are teacher training institutions. And they're looking at how they can use the arts in terms of training their, not just the teachers, but the teachers who teach the teachers to use the arts in the classroom.
Any other specific answers? Yes, no?
I think for us, the State Department of Education's 21st Century Learning Program, that particular program is very open to community-based arts programs, and the arts engagement is very aligned with the goals of the 21st Century Program, and I think Rhode Island's been really creative in supporting community art spaces with it.
I'd say philanthropy. Not so much because of the money they give, which is always appreciated, but because they've changed the tone of the conversation. They've opened up the possibility for private donors to fund public school arts partnerships for the first time. And they've also forced all of us to interact with each other, even though we hate it. I mean, you're always going to these convenings, and you think, oh my God, I gotta sit next to this one again. So, but in the end, it does generate just the kind of surprising epiphany that I was talking about earlier, that there always are some ideas that start under those circumstances, and that later, not all of them, but some of them will turn into full-fledged collaborations, partnerships, or initiatives of their own.
And I would add my own answer, individual maniacs, the catalysts. It almost doesn't matter where they are, which institution they're in, but these are the indestructible energies that actually are the catalysts for change. And I've found them in police departments, I have found them in social service agencies, I have found them as maniac individual artists, but to me they are the single greatest resource in driving forward a change agenda. I think we have time for one more question, really quick responses from our panel. It's basically asking for a recommendation. Can the panel offer a challenge to us in the field to create one unifying effort in our specific community? Can you recommend a specific challenge, a unifying effort for people to consider bringing back to their home community? I can think of one.
Go.
It's sitting on those two chairs. How do you foster those conversations so that the scrappy organizations are in full exchange with the venerable organizations in a way that they can find the greater truth that contains them both? How can you make that happen in your hometown? What else?
Just to echo that, the Wellspring Consulting that I mentioned earlier, Chris Keevil is the principal, and we were having a conversation recently, and he was putting forth the thought that our way we have solved our cultural problems in the past is through institutions, forming organizations where there's a hierarchical structure and someone assigns responsibility, there's accountability, there's a certain structure. And what is evolving now are these social networking where people come together around a single issue, they're passionate, there's no hierarchical structure, and they come together and then it goes apart. And he is saying that he is seeing something evolving in the middle, something that has the passion and the drive and the immediacy of the social networks, but that has some of the characteristics of an organization, the accountability and structure. And so I think it's going back into our communities and looking for what is that new thing and how can we be part of creating that.
This might be kind of trite, but what do you want for young people across institutions? I personally might be kind of wary of sending a young person to a museum from my organization for fear that they might feel it's intimidating or institutional, or that they might look at them as a young person of color from the inner city and make all kinds of judgments about them, or that I may fear that this young person may fear those things. But I still want young people at my organization to look at and experience works of art and objects and interact with them. So that is what I want, and that is what this institution wants. So how do we work from a place of common goals, but also recognizing that we have a lot of hang-ups and relationship building to do?
Yeah, I actually think that arts education in Boston is in a much better place today than it was 20 years ago. Peggy mentioned in her introduction of Curtis that we have a high school for the performing arts. That wasn't in place 20 years ago. There's much more activity and partnerships in the Boston public schools. And I think maybe it's because of scarcity and just the challenge of that environment, but arts organizations of all kinds are interacting much more productively than they did a generation ago. There's much less turf defense and consciousness of boundaries. So even though we're all used to this common complaint about the decline of arts education in the United States, secular trends are what they are, but I think that in Boston we have already experienced some of the uptick that we all wish we could achieve nationwide.
So it's a just keep going statement, moving in the right direction.
I hope we are, yeah.
Yeah. Let me, before I turn it over to Ken and we acknowledge our panel, I want to close with two, of course, etymological notes as a roundup. I'm an etymology freak. The first is the word culture, one of the flagship words of artistic elitism, which etymologically has nothing to do with high arts or fancy educated people. Etymologically, it's much more related to the agar that was in your 9th grade Petri dish in biology class. It basically means the medium in which you grow, as in agriculture. And that is the greater truth that contains us all, is that in fact culture is the medium in which we grow. And to hold that in mind and to bring all the players to that understanding. And the second and closing etymology is a beloved word in the arts, the word bravo. When it was first brought into the English-speaking theater, it was not called out in recognition of great virtuosity as we do it now. In the opera, I mean, the highest of high arts, you yell bravo in recognition of impeccable virtuosity. When it was first called out in the English-speaking theater, it was called out in recognition of great courage. If someone took a chance on stage, whether they completely pulled it off or not, you acknowledged that moment of courage by calling out bravo. So I want to close our time with that word in acknowledgement of what we are asking you to go home and do, which is take acts of courage to change the culture in which your organization, you as a person, and your colleagues can learn from one another and build the culture in which community arts learning happens. So for those acts of courage, whether they are pulled off perfectly or not, the appropriate word to end with is bravo. Bravo. Thank you.